sci-fi and fantasy short stories. Of Risk and Relativity by Lesley Herron. Chapter 24, Siege the Day. Hot breath raced from an open maw that dripped with saliva. Blood leaked from the cuts all along his fur-covered arms and legs, but the wolf's gaze never faltered, never wavered. Its only thought was to win, to eviscerate and prevail. A long line of pink spittle slid across Winter's bared teeth as tremors rippled through his exhausted muscles.
"We don't have to fight. We just need to draw its attention away."
Ignoring the shadow bug, the wolf lunged back into glorious combat, charging down the towering gray form. Glinting steel raced through the air, missing Winter by inches as he dodged. Several strands of fur plumed down from his scalp. The weapon cut a deep trench into the earth, and dirt exploded outward. The swordsmith ripped the blade free and brought it around for another strike, forcing the wolf to change course yet again. Sitting idle for millennia hadn't dulled Kalos's skill, unlike the edge of the tarnished and chipped sword he rotated in one hand. As the creature rocketed toward him, shadows dripping off its hide like sweat, he swung the blade out in a slicing arc, ready to divide the beast into pieces. But its attack had been a feint, and the wolf juked to the side at the last second and leapt to close the gap. Sharp canines sank into his wrist, causing Kalos to drop the sword and stumble back beneath the weight of the impact. Footing caught at last, he grabbed the furry creature by the scruff on the back of its neck and yanked it free, ignoring the chunk of flesh that went with it. As the wolf's muzzle gnashed and snapped, the swordsmith clamped his now empty hand around it, his massive palm entirely encapsulating the animal's mouth. And when the beast thrashed in response, Kalos hoisted it 10 feet off the ground by its snout and began to crush down with inexorable force. Suffocating pressure built in Winter's throat as the burning need for oxygen replaced his need to fight. His long claws scrabbled and tore at the arms of the giant, slicing out more chunks of gray, earthy flesh. Foam began to bubble up in his mouth as he fought to pull in even a single breath, but the swordsmith's hands were clamped too tight around his nose and muzzle, keeping his jaw glued shut.
"Hold on. I can fix this."
Shadow began to pool between the giant's fingers, and Winter waited, growling and whining with each agonizing second that passed. But the shadow bug could not budge the iron grip, failing to pry away even a single digit. His eyes burned as the edges of his vision grew dark. Despite his best efforts, kicking hind legs and thrashing claws, he was losing strength. And then, rising from the depths of the molten whirlpool of their shared consciousness, Winter began to wake, the more cohesive and sentient thoughts of his human form breaking to the surface. He blinked, still in his animal form, and realized that he had been shoved to the front at a really, really bad time. A dull, wet-sounding thwunk pulled him from his panic, and Winter tried to recoil with a muffled scream as something burst out of the giant's chest like some science fiction parasite. The gray giant stumbled, and its grip, thankfully, relaxed, allowing the wolf to wriggle free. Immediate regret flooded Winter, as he was now falling through open air. He landed hard on the ground at the swordsmith's feet and sucked in several deep gulps of precious, sweet night air before he managed enough sense to scrabble back before he was recaptured.
"Oh, hey, you're awake? We should probably run now."
A yelp erupted from his throat as Winter spun his head left, then right. He didn't know where the voice had come from, but he did agree with it, whatever it was. He glanced up to see the Titan, idly inspecting the massive javelin now protruding from its chest, without even a glint of concern in its tiny eyes. Kalos prodded the thick wooden shaft a few times before tugging against it. It resisted, firmly planted in his body. He grunted, deciding to deal with the inconvenience later, and turned toward the rampart, searching for the cause. He spotted two figures flailing their arms near one of the ballista.
"I told you it needed to be higher. Hurry and reload."
A pang of irritation lanced through Herron, his jaw tightening as he hauled over another of the massive spears. It was basically a small tree with a metal point attached to the front, and while it wouldn't normally wind him like it had, he'd hoisted much larger logs, he was still recovering from being stabbed in the gut. He managed to drop it into the flight track and moved to the crank used to retract and reset the drawstring.
"Put your back into it. These guards were firing one of these off every minute. What's taking you so long?"
Lucian threw his uninjured arm out toward the chaos below. Herron stopped cold, shooting his brother a deadpan look, then gestured at the half-dozen bodies that littered the ground around them. The ballista was ridiculously, unnecessarily massive, requiring an entire team to operate. Lucian sneered.
"Surely the champion of the Folkgrave line isn't making excuses. Though if you're too weak, I could find a little girl to help you."
Herron turned to his brother and shoved him hard in his good shoulder. Lucian stumbled a step, managing to keep himself upright only by the grace of Theara. He whirled around on his little sibling and shoved him back in kind.
"What the hell is wrong with you? That lumbering creature is still out there, likely tearing your precious wolf limb from limb."
Throwing himself back into the winch, Herron ignored the painful tug at his organs as he cranked it into place with surprising ferocity, reveling in the shocked look on his brother's face. He had been dedicating himself to the construction of the Twisted Settlements for over a year, a small penance towards the massive debt of his past sins, and the physical and mental toil had honed him into something far more capable than the weak person he used to be, someone that could hold up those he had failed in his youth.
"Impressive."
With a small nod, Lucian added,
"If only you had shown that resolve when our lives were on the line. Now get beneath that thing and move it to the left."
Gnashing his teeth, Herron crouched down beneath the rear of the ballista in order to leverage the giant weapon into motion, a task normally done by a team of soldiers. Honestly, why were these things so massive? The wooden frame of the ballista dug into his shoulder as Herron heaved, attempting to maneuver the siege weapon.
"No, my left, you idiot!"
Lucian began painfully climbing the short ladder to squint through the sighting mechanism, searching for the swordsmith.
Whose dumb idea was this, anyway?
The landscape below the rampart had finally cleared of nobles and socialites, leaving only the scramble of a handful of guards attempting to rein in a shadow wolf and...
Wait, where did the beast go?
Herron released a silent groan, his wrists and knuckles shaking as beads of sweat formed across his forehead, the weight of the siege weapon doubling as Lucian leaned against it. His brother let out a shrill, un-Lucian-like scream of surprise, following a tremor in the rampart. Herron had barely a moment to question the ordeal when the once Regent Lord flung himself from the ballista and impacted the ground beside him. The siege weapon was quite literally ripped from his shoulders as something pulled it off the stone wall, shattering the base as the swordsmith tossed it to the ground below. Splinters of wood and metal showered them, forcing Herron to jump atop Lucian's prone body, shielding him from the debris as the Titan's other hand clamped down on the stone rampart, bringing the swordsmith's massive head into view. They had been found. Hauling his brother halfway up, the two of them stumbled across the crumbling path, ducking and dodging the rain of destruction. Herron skid to a halt as a large beam of timber slammed into the rampart in front of him, blocking their retreat and peppering him with grit and dirt. He looked over his shoulder to see the swordsmith fumbling around for them, its beady eyes searching through the gaps in the crenellated wall. They had no good way to escape. The stairwell was blocked, the beast behind them, and the wall was becoming unstable. They could jump, but the fall would probably kill them. Probably. Herron ran a hand down over his face with a silent groan. Their grand scheme had become a trap of their own making. But as giant fingers smashed into the racks that held the remaining javelins, he felt a heavy weight of a bad idea roll over him. This wasn't likely to end well, but at least one of them might make it. He deposited his brother near the beam of wood and lunged into action, stumbling a little at the fissuring cracks that raced out from the swordsmith's damaging attacks. Herron lowered himself to one knee and hefted a huge javelin into his arms, wobbling beneath its weight. Kalos pried away chunks of the rampart, tearing down the little elf's hiding place one brick at a time. The large fissures had begun to spread to the ground, and, with a loud, ominous crack, the wall began to buckle under its own weight. His fingers lost their purchase on the crumbling rampart, and he scrambled to reach the little creatures. The ground beneath Herron's feet shifted to a steep incline, and he began to slide down the slope, the weight of his weapon pulling him faster. "It's now or never," he thought, as he forced his tired legs into motion. Uneven strides carried him across the toppling surface, and he let loose a silent battle cry as he dodged past those searching fingers to sink the spear tip right through the creature's head. Few things worked harder in this reality than gravity, and it was highlighted by the speed at which it brought down not only the wall, but the giant gray titan as well. Between the force of Herron's attack and the swordsmith's mass, the impact was just enough to knock the creature free and send the two of them out and down towards the unforgiving cobblestones below. Herron held onto the shaft of wood, sending up a prayer to Theara to make it out of this alive as he watched the ground rush up to greet them. As the two of them slammed into the earth, he was launched from his perch with enough force that he rolled and bounced some 30 feet away. The hard ground tore at his clothes and skin until he skid to a stop, coughing around a mouthful of dirt. Pain rippled through every nerve, and if he had a voice, he'd be cursing up a storm in agony. But that sensation reassured Herron that he was still very much alive. He silently groaned as he pushed himself to all fours, looking at the twisted body of the felled giant before him. He breathed out in relief to see the beast dead, but jumped back in shock when he heard a long, rumbling moan escape the swordsmith. Kalos blinked open his eyes, staring up at the twilight sky, and tried to sit up. Except that he couldn't. He had depleted his collection of swords, and was now being anchored to the ground by those pesky giant spears protruding from his back and head. He moved his giant hands to the massive wooden shafts and began to pull, without much luck. He was pinned to the ground like a bug in a collection. Herron allowed himself a brief moment of reprieve, flopping onto his back with a heavy sigh. But of course, no matter how great his victory, it could not go uncriticized by his brother.
"Get up, you idiot! That won't keep it pinned forever!"
Lucian, miraculously still alive, picked his way carefully across the crumbled remains of the rampart, gingerly moving from one unstable surface to the next until he reached the prince.
"The next time we go with my plan."
He wanted to remind his brother that using the ballista was his plan, but Herron decided not to argue. He slowly forced himself to his feet, every joint crying out in pain. He spun, searching for their third companion. Which, of course, was perfect timing for him to spot Winter, charging directly at them, mouth open and teeth bared. Herron braced for impact, raising his arms to shield himself, when the wolf blew right past him, making a mad dash for the forest beyond the city ruins. In that brief moment, however, he had noticed the creature had become less muscled, and that the rage it once wore on its face had shifted to a mask of panic. So that's what a werewolf looks like when it turns back. Viren mused with a smile on his face. It was oddly pathetic. He shrugged and began hobbling after Winter, sliding underneath his brother's uninjured arm to help him move. Lucian glanced back at the destruction behind them. The ruined city sat just a little more ruined, hardly anything more than a pile of rocks and a sea of destroyed tents. Several small fires were flickering higher now, and the giant gray titan still struggled, unable to free itself. All in all, not a place he would ever be eager to visit again. As he watched their party leave, and once he was sure the wolf was truly gone, Hollow marched out from behind his hiding place, flanked by a group of gleaming soldiers. Approaching the swordsmith, he stared down at it, rage twisting his once beautiful face. He repeatedly kicked the creature, taking out his anger, as his guards set to work loosing the javelins that pinned it down. Once the ancient titan was free, Hollow fluttered his remaining wing, tattered and half-melted. He looked at it, his foot paused in the act of a final kick, when an idea struck him at the sight of blackened feathers. He turned to the spot in the trees where he had seen the elves flee, and then to Kalos.
Fetch the Shade Eaters!
In his youth, Artemis's favorite memories were the stories his mother told him. Tales of dwarven mines and their forges far beneath the earth where hammers wrought metal into wonders. Those tales lost their veneer when he learned that it was all fiction, and that most dwarves had long since migrated to the surface. Those that still toiled in the mountains rarely lived in the mines they worked, and the wonders they crafted were usually simple tools or odds and ends for erecting fences or fixing wagons. But having followed Dromir into the depths of a volcano, those childhood memories flared back to life. Despite the abundance of dwarves here, this was not a dwarven city. Humans, Selkies, Dusk Elves, and even a few owl-faced individuals were among the many surface races that peppered the eclectic community. The natives, however, were the Mugrarnins, the creatures formed from the molten rock itself, apparently a distant relative of the ancient dwarves. After some negotiation, Artemis had been granted permission to observe their craft. The god had yet to speak to Eric, and he'd rather pass his time learning instead of waiting. The 3-foot rocky creature before him, glowing orange at the seams, didn't use tools to work the metal, but their bare hands. They sculpted the bronze alloy as if it were clay, painstakingly crafting each line of intricate detail and smoothing the surface until it was flawless. They were, after all, forming their next body. Now, despite what he had assumed, observing didn't mean watching the Mugrarnins. Artemis had been instructed to fan the forges with the hand bellows or dump the next vat of metal ingots into the giant pots. At each step of the process, he was given a task, and by the time the stocky figure had finished another panel of their body, sweat was pouring off him in buckets.
Pardon my curiosity.
Artemis paused his pumping of the bellows to run a hand across his forehead.
But as I understand it, once this construct is complete, you plan on shifting your soul into it.
The Mugrarnin nodded, speaking slowly, the words clacking around in their throat like stones.
Yes. Transition or die.
Artemis returned to his duties, fanning the flame once more as the stone creature returned to their work.
Moving a soul is no simple task.
The way he understood it, this race of dwarf only had a few years of life before they cooled into hardened stone, and judging by the appearance of this one, such a fate was not far off.
How do you plan on achieving this?
Is it some form of soul magic? He didn't want to say necromancy. Most reactions to the word were often of fear or disgust. The Mugrarnin chuckled in reply.
No.
It reached to the chest of the automaton body and pulled back a plate to reveal a complex knot of mechanisms beneath.
Shade siphon.
You can move a shade into a new vessel? Artemis's eyes widened with the quickening of his pulse. This wasn't unheard of. Necromancy could, in theory, do something similar. He hadn't figured out how yet, but there were notorious issues with such a feat. He glanced from the metal body to the squat creature that planned to inhabit it. But your shape is different. Wouldn't that cause tears in your shade as you stretch to fit it? The creature gestured to several smaller sections within the panel, emphasizing the devices filled with an inky black fluid.
Bypass modules to bridge the gaps.
Taking a step back, Artemis nearly tripped over his own feet. Bypass? They had devised a way to solve one of the fundamental issues within his craft. When manipulating shade, tearing and subsequent scarring could quickly lead to complete non-viability. And without a viable shade, a soul could not take root in a physical form. It was the glue between the two, the energizing force, and too much damage to one shade meant certain, irreversible death. But the idea of being able to circumvent the damage, essentially fusing any tears that arose during the process, made his mind spin. Can you teach me?
There you are.
Lucian, held aloft by his brother, practically wheezed the accusation as the pair of them stumbled into a small clearing by a quiet stream. His eyes had locked onto the werewolf crouching beside a bush. Breathing heavy from their less-than-graceful escape into the woods, the two of them had been tracking the lichen for almost an hour now. He gazed at the wolf, noting that, well, to say he looked odd would have been an understatement. Winter was still in the stages of transforming back into his human self. Thick patches of auburn fur were sloughing off him, scattering the ground at his feet like dried pine needles, exposing a layer of rosy pink skin beneath. In fact, if it had not been for the constant trail of shed fur, they likely would not have found him in the low light.
What were you thinking, running off like that?
Lucian tossed out another accusatory finger.
What was I thinking?
Winter shot to his feet indignantly.
What the hell were y'all thinking?
For the love of the Yara, will you put some clothes on?
I ain't done talking yet,
Winter roared his response, his wild gaze thrust between the stuffy Regent Lord and his brother.
If either one of you had listened to me, we wouldn't be in this mess.
Varen extracted himself, turning to cautiously approach the lichen. He held up his hands in a pacifying gesture and mouthed the word,
"Sorry." Nah, you don't get to just apologize for what you two did back there.
Winter turned that clawed hand on the path behind them.
I could have killed someone.
Oh, how terrible, Lucian drawled. Easily having the highest body count out of the three of them, he simply rolled his eyes as the dry comment left him.
Trust me, it gets easier after a while. You think I want that?
Winter shuddered, the constant memory replaying like a flickering movie reel in his mind. A scene of a blood-stained living room and the coppery tang on his tongue. The reason he had spent so many of his years forcing himself to change his lifestyle to keep the wolf at bay, reducing his meat intake, yoga therapy, and living in the middle of nowhere had failed to mollify the raging animal inside him. And if he wasn't quick to control his anger, it would reemerge once more. I didn't want to come here in the first place. Winter turned on the Regent Lord. But oh no, let's take the werewolf into the world with 3 moons. Listen, Fancy Pants, I don't care what your mommy issues are, but you put everyone at risk. Straightening his spine, Lucian marched the short distance to the lichen. You, his voice quivered. Flea-ridden mongrel, speak to me like that again, and I'll... Closing the gap between them, Winter shoved his snarling face right into the elf's, his still enlarged canines snapping. You listen here, you bat-eared bastard! He relished at the sight of instinctual fear creeping across those crimson eyes. You ever pull a stunt like that again, and I'll show you why I work so hard keeping the wolf at bay. Rolling his eyes, Herron shoved his way between them, separating the pair with his hands, and dramatically sighed. He turned to his brother, signing, "Stop bickering. We need to keep moving." The spell broken, Lucian shook himself and slapped those hands away, snarling,
I don't understand what you're saying. Why do you insist on doing that?
I know we don't like him, but he has a point. Herron is really bad about forgetting that.
Winter's hand flew up to knock against his head, recoiling from a feeling like spiderwebs stuck in his hair. I'm tired of this place, tired of you 2 idiots, and tired of this voice in my head.
Oh, remember? I am Wraith. I took the bites out of your shade and made you transform.
Wraith huddled in a tiny dip in the lichened shade, nuzzling himself in for a long nap.
Sorry about that.
Winter whirled around on the prince, leveling a dangerous finger at him. You better get this thing out of my noggin, stat! Herron nodded and started walking towards him.
You are really angry, and I am the only thing keeping that wolf thingy from coming out again.
On second thought, he can stay. Winter pointed from one elf to the other. But you both can get bent. Lucian, tired of the bickering and self-righteous fools that had served as his traveling companions, ripped off a small branch full of densely clustered leaves and thrust it to the werewolf.
Cover yourself. Your nakedness is exhausting.
Winter grabbed the branch and began batting the pompous lord with it. And whose fault is that? After giving him a few good thumps, he chucked the tree limb at him, raised both hands in a rude gesture, and stomped off into the brush again. I'm leaving, and don't follow me this time! Rubbing at the growing migraine, Herron slumped back against a tree, sliding down the bark until his rump hit the dirt. Wincing, he tugged back his tunic, exposing the hastily applied bandage, and he grimaced at the sight of blood leaking from the gauze. He leaned his head back with a silent groan. If he made it out of here alive, he was going to take a week-long nap, and insist that Evan cook some of that fast food he was always talking about. A hamburger, which he had always wanted to try, and a batch of those French fries.
You're bleeding.
His brother's words cut through Herron's fantasy, and he looked up, waving the concern off. He stuck his finger in the dirt, scrawling out, "Later." Lucian moved to the edge of the tree line, squinting in through the blackened skeletal trunks of the forest. Quiet insect noises filled the air, and he glanced at the twilight sky, affirming that they had yet to exit the dark phase realm. He moved to the bank and followed the winding river with his gaze until he could see a break in the landscape, and at the very edge of his vision, he could see amber-colored treetops sprouting from the sea of black. Nearly there. He turned back, pointing at his brother.
That wound, it's from the little girl you let stab you in the gut.
Herron frowned, but nodded, not wanting to rehash this conversation. Lucian looked down at him, not with contempt, but with disappointment.
I would have killed the child. Do you think that makes me callous?
His frown deepened as Herron puzzled what his brother was talking about. Of course that made him callous, bordering on evil. What kind of man could kill a child in cold blood? Lucian huffed, seeing the answer plain on his brother's face. He dove a hand into his robes and pulled something out, flinging it at his sibling, who caught it deftly.
Just remember, my way would have ended with only one death. Yours ended in potential war.
Shocked, Herron looked down at what he now clutched in his hands. A small, glittering black stone. As he touched it, he could feel something within, buzzing with chaotic rage like a trapped wasp. He dropped it, not liking the repulsive feel of it on his skin.
Don't you recognize her?
Lucian sneered.
Poor little Amari. Better that she had died than become that.
Herron scrabbled back from the stone. His gaze flickered between it and his sibling, back and forth, rage building inside him. But it fizzled out quickly when he realized his brother was right. His attention landed on the black gem.
Should I have struck her down?
Had his moral choice been wrong? No. He refused to believe that his act of compassion was wrong. Herron scooped up the stone and held it fast, allowing the sickening buzzing that throbbed in his hand to rage. One more reminder, one more sin to pay penance for. Satisfied that his point had been made, Lucian nodded toward the river.
If we follow this, it will take us back to the Wild Queen's borders.
Herron groaned silently. Of course, it was in the opposite way Winter had gone. But, just as he was about to point this out, the sound of the lichen angrily stomping back their way broke over the clearing. Bursting straight through the brush, Winter pointed at each of them in turn without breaking stride. "I'm still mad at y'all." He jabbed a thumb over his shoulder back the way he had come as he passed them, his expression tightening. "But I'll be pissed with y'all on the go. Let's move." Herron exchanged a questioning glance with his equally confused brother when the sound of clanking armor and thundering footfalls echoed off the trees, signaling an army was headed their way. With a sigh, Lucian started hobbling.
You heard the mutt. Let's go.
You've been listening to Of Risk and Relativity by Lesley Herron, Book 5 in the series here on Tall Tale TV. If you would like to listen to the entire book in one place, or any of her other novels, you can find them at talltaletv.com/series, or by following the links in the description. Where the heck am I?
I think we are lost.
Holy moly!
Wait, what? What? Huh?
I forgot you was in there.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I was napping.
Right. Listen, not to be rude or nothing, but, I'm not used to having a whatever you are roving around my noodle.
Oh, don't worry. It is easy. The rules are really simple.
Rules? What rules?
Rule number 1, we are not allowed to eat trees or plants.
I'm vegan?
That's weird. I thought your name was Winter, but okay. Rule number 2, no eating bugs.
Wasn't planning on it.
Except for spiders.
Spiders?
So if you see any, let me know and we can eat those.
I'll pass, thanks.
Rule number 4, can only eat most of a people. Rule number 5, never skip leg day.
Wait, hold
Rule
up.
number 6.
Run it back a sec there. What was that about eating people?
Oh, only most of a people. Big difference.
No, it's not. I don't plan on eating any of a people. And if you think I'm gonna be gnawing on some guy's leg or something...
No, not you, silly. Me. I eat their shade, but only most so that they doesn't die.
Oh, I thought you meant like, never mind. As long as we aren't killing anybody.
Of course not. I mean, I ate like almost all of your shade, and you is fine, mostly. Now, rule number 6.
Wait,
All
what?
the shinies we find belong to me.